All right, we're going to talk about street communists versus elite communists, and this is going to be important as we tackle the year 2024, which is going to be full of all kinds of fireworks and spicy things out there. So let's go over this. Remember, there are two different divisions of communism, and there always have been. It's always been the case. There are the elite communist scum. Those are the ones in government and the bureaucracy, the judges, the professors. They're not true believers generally, but they're the ones who actually hold power. And then there are street communist scum. You see them all over America today. The LGBTQ rally and the climate change rally and the Black Lives Matter rally and the hate all the Jews rally or whatever. They're all the same people. Communist street scum. They are true believers. They both have roles to play. Critically important roles to play. They work with each other. Oftentimes there is tension between the two groups. After all, the true believers will have demands of the elites, but the elites don't share the belief, and that creates tension, and we'll get to that in a little while. But they do work with and for each other. What do the elites want? What do they really want? What do the Chuck Schumers of the world want? Well, they want money. They want power. How do you get that money and power if you're Chuck Schumer? Well, one of the oldest ways to do this, if you don't have a soul, is you find a way to hurt your enemies or intimidate your enemies. But Chuck Schumer can't do that himself. He's a useless, weak old man. He would never risk getting his hands dirty, but Chuck Schumer knows he doesn't have to do that. He has an army of street animals out there waiting. So if, let's say, you want the Supreme Court to stop you from destroying the Constitution. If you're Chuck Schumer, you don't have to show up at Brett Kavanaugh's house with a gun to assassinate him. You just have to give this speech, and you know orders will be followed.
I want to tell you, Gorsuch, I want to tell you, Kavanaugh, you have released the whirlwind, and you will pay the price. You won't know what hit you if you go forward with these awful decisions.
About 5 minutes later, a communist street animal from California loaded his weapons up and flew clear across the country and was caught, praise God, outside of Brett Kavanaugh's home, getting ready to shoot him in the face. Elite scum give the orders. The street scum acted out. But what do the street scum get out of all this? After all, it seems like they're pretty put upon. They just have to follow Chuck Schumer's orders. No. The elite scum have a role to play in this too. The elite scum have power, real power. What is real power? What does that mean? The protection of the law, the justice system of a nation. The justice system of a nation is where the real power lies. After all, when you control who can remain free, who doesn't remain free. I mean, you have the power to execute people when you control the justice system. You have all the guns, you have the cops, you have the judges. The justice system is where the power lies. Well, the elites, they will provide the legal protection for the streets to do what they do. A lot has been made about this Merrick Garland testimony and how ridiculous it is, but really the ridiculousness of it was the point. What was Merrick Garland really saying when he gave this testimony in front of Congress? He wasn't saying that they really don't have the ability to track someone down if they're committing a crime at night. No, it was not what he was saying. What he was saying was he was telling the street animals that if they continue to carry out their orders, that he will conveniently be unable to track them down.
I will say you're quite right. There are many more prosecutions with respect to the blocking of the abortion centers, but that is generally because those actions are taken with photography at the time, during the daylight, and seeing the person who did it is quite easy. Those who are attacking the pregnancy resources centers, which is a horrid thing to do, are doing this at night, in the dark. We have put full resources on this.
It's laughably ridiculous, but understand what he's actually saying. He wasn't talking to you. He wasn't talking to me. He wasn't talking to Congress. He was talking to the street animals. He was letting them know, hey, just wear a mask, maybe wait till after dark, and we'll just be unable to track you down. Dang it, we did the best we could. They have critically important roles to play. They work with each other. They help each other to burn down America. The elites, in the end, they will receive all the money and power and all the things that come from burning down a country and looting it. The streets, in the end, won't. They'll all be thrown in prison or shot like they normally are, but they think they'll get something out of the deal. And they'll just keep following orders, though, and they'll keep following along as these dirtballs in office use words like genocide to gin up outrage.
If you want to know what an unfolding genocide looks like, open your eyes. It looks like the forced famine of 1.1 million innocents.
We should not have to tolerate anti-Semitism or bigotry for all Jewish students, whether they are pro-genocide or anti-genocide.
Genocide. They love that word. It's not just something they come up with recently. They use it all the time. Genocide this and genocide that. That sounds really scary. Joining me now, James Lindsay is going to explain some of this language to us, as he always does with his books and everything else. In fact, his book, The Marxification of Education, probably one you should pick up. I mean, he writes all of them, but for this topic, yeah. James, why do they love words like genocide? Genocide's a pretty big deal, and yet they use it all the time. Why?
Because it's so evocative. It's so powerful. Who could be possibly in favor of a genocide? So if they can convince you that something's a genocide, you have a lot of things going on all at once. We have to resist a genocide with all possible force. We have a moral duty, a moral obligation to get involved against a genocide and to take the correct side on that kind of a thing. But you're right that they overuse the word. I mean, I also left out, by the way, the iron law of woke projection, which is that they say that the other side is doing what they're actually doing or defending. But just to your point that they overuse the word genocide, I want to remind you and all of your viewers that the idea of getting in shape, losing weight, eating a better diet is characterized in the same bodies of literature as a fat genocide, because it will destroy the culture of fat people. So, I mean, this is a word that they use and have used for a long time. And so losing weight is a fat genocide. Curing people who have hearing problems is a deaf genocide. I'm not kidding. They say that it destroys their culture. So they like to overuse that word in the most preposterous of ways. But the reason is because it's so evocative and such a big deal and forces a moral obligation onto their side.
James, there's something you talk about a lot. I try to focus on it as much as possible too, is the words, the language they use. They're so purposeful about them because everything is based on deception, right? Everything has to be a lie to try to shade what is real. They are so purposeful with how they use words and how they use terms. We are not, and honestly, it fails us a lot.
Yeah, we're really kind of sloppy about how we use words, and they're not just intentional with their language. Like you said, their language is coded. They're quite explicit about this. I'm reading a book right now that's not really related to this, but of course it's woke, so it's related to this. It's called Critical Constructivism by an educator named Joe Kinchelow, and he's very clear that the practice of critical constructivism involves the practice of using coded language. And so they rewrite the meanings of words. The saying that I often give is that I've borrowed from somewhere is that communists share your vocabulary, but they don't share your dictionary. They repurpose words to mean something slightly different. So in this case, what genocide means is that you are doing something that stops them from having their way. And it doesn't even have to involve people dying, as a matter of fact. While that is the case to some degree in Gaza, it's not the case in the fat genocide that people losing weight actually kills anybody. It can just be destroying a culture. In this case, we have to ask, though, if we take their word at face value, which we never should, because every communist term conceals an agenda, what's the people group being genocided here? Is it Hamas, which is a stated terrorist organization? That doesn't seem like the genus that usually attaches to genocides.
James, the malcontents people see, I did a little bit on this yesterday, and I know you've talked about it before. the organization behind these protests is something people don't focus on. They'll see a bunch of fat English majors on the quad smoking weed and talking about how much they hate Jews, and they think, well, that's really the source of our problems. But these people, so many of these people are paid, organized, full-time radicals with an in-depth organizational structure with parent organizations, foreign donors, Chinese donors, and yet that part doesn't get talked about. We yell at the English major, but he's not the one that's actually facilitating this stuff.
No, he's a dude showing up to church, and we're completely leftist churches protest. So we're completely ignoring the organizational structure that's organizing the church meeting in the first place. We see that the tents are all the same. They all came from the same purchasing. We now have seen that there's been exposés of the organizations, the parent organizations paying for that. We saw the arrests at some of these college campuses where in some states, the law is doing its job. Even in New York, they're trying. And at Washington University in St. Louis, the police came in, they arrested a bunch of the worst offenders at the campus there. And what they found is that the preponderance of the people that they arrested, not the people necessarily there, but the people that got arrested, weren't either students or faculty. They were outsiders that were brought in to agitate the campus. Like you said, we know that there's foreign money coming into this. We can surmise that there's likely Chinese money behind it at some level. We know that there's Qatari money behind it. So this is a foreign influence operation. This is a domestic communist influence operation that's designed to stoke up unrest on college campuses and start a cultural revolution process. My guess is that what's going on right now is a training and recruitment drive. They're looking for who takes up leadership roles. They're not trying to really get concessions. They're not trying to win this volley. They're trying to figure out who the leaders are going to be in the real mayhem over the summer so that they can figure out those people and get them trained properly between now and, I would guess, late summer, early fall, right before the election.
James, we have a Democrat president right now. We have a Democrat Senate, as you well know, and it's not as if I'm Team GOP, as everyone knows, but these are Democrats. All these people in the quad, they vote Democrat. All the organizers, they vote Democrat. The dirty professors, they vote Democrat. So why in the world would Democrats be creating Democrat unrest underneath a Democrat president when it makes him look bad? Why would they do such a thing?
Well, the closest historical parallel to what's happening on college campuses today was the emergence of the Red Guard in 1966 out of elite Chinese universities like Beijing University and Tsinghua University in China. And the question there is, well, who were the targets of the Red Guard? Was it some, enemy force? Was it the United States? Was it Great Britain? Was it Japan? No, it was the currently ruling CCP, which would be the equivalent of the Democrats today. That CCP had ousted Mao Zedong from power, so they needed to regain and consolidate power into the Maoist faction, and the Red Guard was unleashed against the CCP. It was not unleashed against the peasantry or the ruling elite. It was unleashed against the CCP, and so we're seeing this historical parallel play out, kind of textbook, because the goal is going to be to extract, if there is a direct goal other than training, to extract radical concessions from the Democratic Party and to lurch the party further left as we go forward.
James, you are the best, my brother. Thank you, as always. I appreciate you.
Yes, sir.
All right. Well, don't forget, these people, they've all done this before. In many cases, they're the same people. Same Social Security number, same fingerprints. Remember the Black Lives Matter riots? I'm actually going to talk about those next. Let's talk to Liz about Minneapolis in particular. Joining me now, Liz Collin. She is the producer of that wonderful documentary you should watch, The Fall of Minneapolis. She wrote a book called They're Lying. Liz, before we get back to all the garbage that happened and the Black Lives Matter and the burning the place down, you know what bums me out when it comes to places like Minneapolis and New York City? I have such fond memories of these places from 20 years ago, 25 years ago. Minneapolis was one of the cooler cities I was ever in, and now it just sucks. And that sucks. It's horrible. It was one of the great American cities. It used to be so great, didn't it?
Oh, absolutely, Jesse. I'm from Minnesota, grew up here, and always had a dream of working my way back to Minneapolis in local television. And so I landed, kind of that dream job back in 2008 and loved Minneapolis, had a home in Minneapolis. But really, it did change after 2020 and nearly overnight. And it's really amazing to me to this day how so many people have let that happen. I think so many people before all this took their safety for granted, and really just this, kind of idyllic, Midwestern city that so many of us loved. It's certainly just not the same anymore.
No, it's not the same anymore. And when it comes to the George Floyd things, one of the things that hits me still is all the people whose lives were ruined and livelihoods were ruined during all that. And then we all kind of just moved on and just forgot about it like it's just some bad memory we don't want to talk about anymore. I remember, well, people like this.
How was last night?
Scary. I live in the high rise right back here, and I seen them as they came down Lake Street. But then they turned and started coming over here, and I'm sitting out looking out my window. And they went straight to Office Max, the dollar store, and every store over here that I go to. I have nowhere to go now. I have no way to get there because the buses aren't running. These people did this for no reason. It's not going to bring George back here. George is in a better place than we are. And last night, I'm going to be honest, I wish I was where George was because this is ridiculous. These people are tearing up our livelihood.
They just ransacked America's cities and people suffered and no one cares anymore. Liz, no one even talks about it anymore.
Yeah, it's unbelievable to me. You instead have kind of the corporate media. This is the reason I left the corporate media after all of this, almost cheerleading this movement in a way. And instead of actually telling these real stories about how lives have been completely destroyed in the wake of all of this, they're almost manipulating the message now, talking about this comeback that no one is seeing in Minneapolis. That's just simply not happening. Repeating these mantras that these so-called leaders in Minneapolis continue to talk about how crime is down. It's not. It's at historic levels. Nearly 4 years later, as we have this conversation, we have a police department that was 890 strong in early May of 2020 that has dwindled to below 500 at this point in Minneapolis. It's unbelievable what is allowed to happen. Again, dozens of cars stolen just last weekend in Minneapolis, whereas before that would be something that would happen almost in the course of a year in this city.
Liz, what goes on inside of these newsrooms? And I understand you've probably worked in many, but when you see biased coverage, or as you pointed out, especially from a national perspective, cheerleading, I don't see as much of that from local newsrooms. And I live in a big city here in Houston. Obviously, there's some craziness, but for the most part, it's more news. And then the second you turn on CNN, MSNBC, it's disgusting. What gets lost in the connection there? I don't get it.
Yeah, you really saw, never before in my career had I seen this manipulation of language. We're not even allowed to refer to this as riots back then. This is civil unrest. We still see, things like that have allowed to, perpetuate it and continue here. So these are riots. That's exactly what happened. 1,500 businesses either damaged or destroyed in Minneapolis, $500 million in damage. Very few have rebuilt, talking about all of these people who've either fled the state or fled the city in the wake of all of this, and also something that's lost. This is namely minority-owned businesses that burned in these riots in Minneapolis. But we almost we kind of have a culture now, I think, in corporate media especially, that they're hiring younger and younger journalists. They're almost activists, in my opinion. So they've been brought up in all of this, that this to them is, what is right, or, what they think is, they support this. And I just never had seen that before. I know perhaps I sound like an old woman right now, but I have been around for a little while. But I couldn't believe how there didn't seem to be any question as to what was happening, that in fact they helped to fan the flames, in my opinion.
I sound like an old person all the time, Liz. I'm 42 going on 80, and when I see everything going on around here, it makes me feel like I'm freaking ancient. I just don't even understand the country we live in anymore. And you know what? I want you to expose a couple more truths before we let you go that you've done in your wonderful documentary. George Floyd, how did he die? Was it systemic racism?
No, there's a reason, in fact, that racism never came up in Derek Chauvin's trial, right? There was no evidence to support any of that. And talking about the evidence that plays out right in front of the media, they're not asking questions about any of this at all. Derek Chauvin, in fact, spent the majority of his career partnered with other minority officers who've never complained about him being a racist. And I could go on and on about all of that. But rather than caring about what actually took place with George Floyd and all of this medical evidence that was suppressed and manipulated, instead, this was used, in my opinion, and I think the evidence shows that also, that the paper trail is clearly there with all of these outside agitators, outside groups that raised money on the back of George Floyd to manipulate the election in 2020, to cause this chaos. And that is all there. It's in the book, in the documentary. I know you do many segments focusing on this as well. And also, you would think that if the media cared, they would track where this money went. Raised, $80 million, I think it is, in total, raised on the back of George Floyd. Well, did it help to go, to help Black lives? Well, no, it did not. And the evidence shows that as well. But to this day, I haven't seen one single corporate media source go ahead and report on any of that.
Golly, what a state we're in. Liz, thanks for being one of the few journalists left. I appreciate it. All right. Julio Rosas spends his time on the ground with all these animals. He was there during all that Antifa, BLM crap, and he's there now. Let's talk to Julio Rosas next about what he's seen. Hang on.
I want to be clear in how I characterize this. This is mostly a protest. It is not, generally speaking, unruly, but fires have been started.
What you're seeing behind me is one of multiple locations that have been burning in Kenosha, Wisconsin over the course of the night. A second night since Jacob Blake was seen shot in the back 7 times by a police officer. And what you are seeing now, these images came and come in stark contrast to what we saw over the course of the daytime hours in Kenosha and into the early evening, which were largely peaceful demonstrations in the face of law enforcement.
Largely peaceful, mostly peaceful. Seems like it was just yesterday. If only we could go back to those days. Thankfully, they'll never pop up again, right? Joining me now, Julio Rosas, field reporter, and you should go subscribe to his Substack called Mostly Peaceful. Julio, let's go back before we go forward. You were obviously knee-deep involved in all that stuff. You wrote a great book about all that stuff. What do you remember most? What part stood out to you the most?
Well, what was just shocking to me is because, prior to 2020, obviously the country had a few riots with Baltimore, with Ferguson. But unlike those riots, they stayed localized. It didn't spread. And so when 2020 hit, it made me realize just how fragile even our society is. And it showed that when there's enough people to cause a complete collapse of a society, even within one city or for a short amount of time, they're going to be able to do it. And that's what played out over and over in 2020, where, there was an initial response to the lawlessness, but because this happened in largely blue jurisdictions, the leaders didn't want to seem like they were racist, quote unquote, for cracking down on peaceful protesters. And so they let them have their way. And that resulted in the chaos that we saw almost 4 years ago at this point. So, looking ahead, because of those rioters, more often than not, receiving very little consequences of their actions, or no consequences for their actions at all. That's why kind of what we're seeing now is the kind of continuation of the far left mobilizing for whatever issue that they want to mobilize for.
Julio, is it the same people? Because it always appears to be the same dirt balls in the streets, but you're the field reporter out there. All those Antifa street animals and BLM street animals, that they just run back into the ether after St. George Floyd was properly honored, or are they all back out there again?
The groups are very much the same groups, and they're mobilizing in the same way that they did back in 2020. And so, in terms of the exact same people, I would guess that yes. When I was at UT Austin, there was one individual who came to the encampment and proudly proclaimed that he had been protesting in the Austin area since 2015. And so, but it is kind of hard to know who is out there because obviously in 2020, with COVID still around, people were wearing masks all the time. People are still wearing masks today, and I'm sure there's quite a few of them that are scared of COVID still. But it is mostly to hide their identities. That's why they're still wearing the mask and not just scarves or balaclavas or whatever have you. And of course, then you have the kifyas that they also use as well. So that's a new flavor to it. So, but I would be remiss to say that it is probably the same exact people, but for sure it's the same groups that are using their connections and networks to mobilize people once again.
Do you see many similarities between what's happening today? I guess I'm trying to figure out, Julio, how many of the people on the ground are really true believers in whatever all this commie gobbledygook is, burn down America stuff, and how many are just young idiots looking for something to do on a Saturday, looking for a cause. They want to go smoke weed with the dirty commies for a little bit. How many true believers are we dealing with out here?
I would say there's quite a bit. And people will say, well, you try to ask these protesters some questions and, look how they're able to easily answer these questions about why they're against Israel and why they're for Gaza, this and that and the other. But again, similar to 2020, it's what I call informed ignorance. Right, where they have been indoctrinated, they accept the dogma without question, which is why the college campuses are erupting right now, because that's kind of the incubator before they head out into the general public. And so I believe, just from seeing them in action and hearing them and them talk, they truly do believe whatever it is that they're spouting. And obviously, I think there's also just kind of the passerby who's kind of interested and kind of wants to see what's going on. But the reason why that they want to be out there is because, no one really wants to camp out in the middle of their quad for days on end, even though they also are free to leave and they often do and come back. But they obviously, want to cause noise. They obviously want to cause ruckus because they can put it on their social media and say, hey, look what I'm doing for this and that and the other. So I would also say that there's kind of that social media clout and influence that they utilize to their advantage. But I think it's just informed ignorance. And that's why they truly believe that America needs to be radically transformed or burned down, as I've heard at these recent protests, because they just truly have just been saturated with all the propaganda over the course of their lives.
Julio, do you get the sense these cities like New York City, for instance, where kind of a lot of this stuff is really heating up right now, you get the sense that the city itself is tired of the whole thing? They were very, very accommodating after all, letting people off scot-free for torching cop cars and all kinds of stuff. But you get the sense that they've had enough, or are they just so broken by now, Julio, that there's nothing that can stop these dirty commies?
I'd say it's a mix. I think obviously a lot of the minority neighborhoods are probably tired of it because they, especially in New York too, they were particularly hit hard. It wasn't just Manhattan, but that's why when you look at Columbia, it's not it's on the Upper West Side. It's in this kind of more affluent area, and obviously the prestige around it. So it's the kind of the common thread where the people who want the police back are the minority neighborhoods and the lower income neighborhoods, and the people who have been advocating to, even still to this day, that they want fewer cops and they want more money taken away from them are the more affluent white areas. And that's pretty common throughout any major city. And so that's why I think with these protests being mainly concentrated on college campuses, they're not fatigued. They are actually invigorated. They are actually kind of been waiting for another reason to kind of go out and do this again, right? And so it will be interesting to see once school is actually done and how this plays out, because obviously a lot of students will be from out of town and they will go back home. And so it'll be interesting to see what further actions are going to be taken by the far left that will once again, largely impact the general population and not just, hyper focus on a college campus.
Yeah, that'll be interesting. Julio, thank you, my brother. I appreciate it.
Thank you very much.
All right, we're not done. Hang on.
It is especially important that we remember the power of young people shaping this country today, of all days, as we once again witness the leadership of those peaceful student-led protests on campuses like Columbia, Yale, Berkeley, and many others.
Why do they love riots and protests so much? Joining me now, Eric Eggers, Vice President of the Government Accountability Institute. Eric, they just love these things, and they have for the entirety of my life. They see the animals out in the streets throwing poop at each other, and the Democrats just adore the whole thing.
Hey, everybody needs a hobby, Jesse. I like family and sports. The Democrats like social unrest and rioting in the streets in the name of social justice. No, it's a tragedy, and I think, unfortunately, it's part of their playbook that they're trotting back out from 2020 because it worked so well. They don't have a George Floyd situation, so they're using Israel's justified defense of itself as a way to, I think, gin up energy, and also because of the policies that the Biden administration is forcing on its federal agencies, they're trying to get out the vote as well.
Now, why? Let's rewind, because you brought it up. In fact, you wrote a book on it. Why does it work for them in the past, even when Republicans are in charge? Why does it work? Why did the George Floyd protests work? And this is also going to work? I don't understand. One was a Republican president. This is a Democrat president.
So I think you have to go back, and it's a great question, by the way. So and let's define what we mean by it. Like, what is it, and what are they trying to do? They're trying to destabilize America's institutions. This is the stated goal of the people that are funding these protests, people like George Soros, people like Communist China. And oh, by the way, the happy and potentially hapless beneficiary of these efforts is the current president, the person they're trying to reelect, which is Joe Biden. So what they're trying to do is trying to engage people, because if you're a voter, are you really excited? If you're somebody that's excited about Palestine, you're excited about pro-Hamas protests, does 81-year-old white guy Joe Biden really excite you? Are you fired up to go turn out to vote for him? No. But you might be fired up to turn out to vote for a social justice cause you believe in, like an oppressed person who killed by the police, like George Floyd, they believe George Floyd was. And you might be fired up to go turn out to vote on behalf of these hapless Palestinians that they're being told by these paid Palestinian organizers to do. So I think it's a get out the vote effort. And so that's why I think it will work, because while they're trying to get out the vote, this is something George Soros has spent money on. He also spends money on weakening election integrity mechanisms. So people, whether or not you should be registered to vote, you're going to be able to vote in the name of democracy. 4 years ago, it was the name of global health. This year, it's going to be the name of social justice and democracy.
Yeah, of course it is. What about the people who block the highways? You see people all the time confused what they're doing. This isn't winning anyone over. You always see people say that when these dirty hippies are shutting down the highway. This isn't winning anyone over. Eric, they're not trying to win people over. We still don't understand that, do we?
We don't. And now I have to say, I live in Florida, so I don't see people blocking the highways, because in Florida, we just arrested 9 people on the University of Florida's campus, 5 at Florida State University in Tallahassee, where I live, and others around the state for doing far less. They've passed laws because they recognize the threat to a civilized society that these protesters left unchecked can pose. And so we don't have that problem here, thanks to the efforts of Governor DeSantis and the legislature, but they do absolutely have that problem elsewhere. It's crazy to me. You played a clip from Ocasio or AOC saying that these protests were peaceful, because the images I've seen coming out of Columbia actually looked just like January 6th, the worst of what they presented from the halls of the Capitol. So it's crazy to me that on the one hand, one image can be this existential threat to democracy. On the other hand, it's evidence of a peaceful collection of college students.
Why are colleges this bad? Do you think they've learned their lesson at all? I think I already know the answer to this question, but it's really bad. Very clearly it's bad. The faculty's bad. Students are bad. They've allowed it. They've encouraged it. They've created this environment. You think they have regrets? How did it get this bad?
Yeah, it's a good question. And I think, unfortunately, it's one that goes back a long time because people like George Soros, people like Communist China, and the people that have made money from there, like Joe Tsai and Roy Singham, who invest in these organizations that pay for these groups to show up and do this. By the way, no less than New York City Mayor Eric Adams said that we know these are outside protesting organizations that are forcing these things to happen. So this is, but you only need like 1% of these people to make this happen. And then the rest of these, the soil is very fertile, let's put it that way. And so I think this is the next version of what they've been protesting since the 60s. But life's a lot better now than it used to be. And so you have to search harder to find things to be upset about. And I think we've also started to elevate people who are aggrieved, right? If you don't have any problems, then what's your identity? So your identity now becomes, well, I identify as transgender. Your identity now becomes, oh, well, I think that, Israel is a war criminal. And we have academic institutions that have a culture that celebrates that mentality, celebrates and empowers it. And that's how you allow things like that are happening in the Ivy League institutions today.
You've brought up China a couple times. China's involved here? What are they doing?
Yeah, and I know you've spoken with colleagues of mine like Seamus Bruner and Peter Schweitzer. Peter has a book out now called Blood Money. And one of the things that it talks about is China's been waging this warfare against us without our knowledge for decades. And so if you go back into the summer of 2020, you remember when the Chinese consulate had to be vacated immediately. It's because we ordered the consulate to be emptied. And so Chinese Communist Party officials burned documents. What they were doing is waging a strategic warfare against us through social division. They have bot farms of Twitter accounts that are trying to foment division on social media like Twitter and TikTok. Twitter had to delete 170,000 Twitter accounts that were proven to be Chinese bots. They proved, by the way, they were Chinese bots because they were tweeting almost exclusively during Chinese business hours. They weren't very subtle about it. But no, China's been part of a propaganda machine aimed to destabilize what's happening in our society. They admit that they've done it. And so they also fund these nonprofit groups like the Freedom Road Socialist Organization, who are on the ground in Kenosha, Wisconsin, making the Kenosha, Wisconsin protests after the shooting verdict. They helped create some of the violence there as well. So ironically, they are working hand in hand with George Soros. I'm not saying that they're coordinating the efforts, but they both have a common goal, which is destabilize American society. And the Joe Biden administration, I think, actually thinks that they will benefit from this in a roundabout way.
What does China get out of a destabilized America? Someone like Soros has hated the West really forever, so it's not hard to figure out why eyebags actually hates us. But China needs us. They need us to buy all their goods. Why does China hate us so much?
China hates us for many reasons. I don't think we have enough time in this program to get into that. But basically, they're mad at us from the Opium War from a couple centuries ago. They see us as the biggest global threat to their geopolitical influence globally. And I think they know they can't beat us militarily. So they're waging war against us through other mechanisms. They're waging war against us through the fentanyl that they send into this country that's killing 100,000 Americans a day that comes via their partnership with the Mexican cartels. They're waging war against us with Glock switches that help foment actual violence on American streets that makes shootings much more deadly. And they're waging war against us from a mental and emotional standpoint. One of the reasons why we have such a high depression rate in this country is because people are addicted to social media things like TikTok, which China considers TikTok's social media algorithm to be a state secret. And by the way, the Chinese version of TikToks, or the American version of TikTok's not allowed in China because they know how bad it is for society. So I think that they want to see a weakened and destabilized United States because a weaker United States can't pose and hold China to account.
How do we stop this? It seems so overwhelming. There's foreign billionaires, nation states, dirty college kids, terrorist college professors. It feels like we're surrounded. Where do we begin to attack it?
I think through programs like this. I think you have to be aware that this is actually happening. I think people should watch your program and people should look at what's happening on college campuses and realize that we're actually maybe not as divided as they want to tell us that we are. we're actually being manipulated by bad foreign actors to try to convince us that we're not as strong, that we're not as unified, that we don't believe as many of the same things as we actually do. So I think just being aware that this is actually not organic, this is not who we are as a country, but this is who our enemies want us to think we are, can help us take a better look in the mirror and have a more honest and hopefully charitable assessment of ourselves.
Yeah, no doubt. Eric, thank you, my brother. I appreciate it. All right. We're not done. We're not done. We have a special light in the mood next. All right, it is time to lighten the mood, and I know you're used to me giving like a final little thought on these specials, right? I give you this, hey, let's rally around it, an action item. We try to do something, and we thought about doing that today too. And then we decided why. It's been heavy. There's been a lot to tackle here, so let's toss to this wonderful video of this trooper who also found a lot to tackle.
You're hurting me! You're hurting me! Ow! 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 Help! Help!
That's hard to carry someone like that. That's a lot when they go limp like that. But it's a dirty communist. She or he, I couldn't tell. Probably weighed about 50 pounds. All right, we'll do it again.